Wednesday, March 26, 2014. Ian was arrested later that same night, Sunday. Apparently he was sitting in his lounge with an ice pack on his head and a glass of red wine, just as he said he would be, plotting revenge, no doubt. The police knocked on his door with a search warrant. They found the body in his car boot. Of course, Zah and I were both asked to give witness statements. The police interviewed us the following evening. In my statement I said that yes, I'd been seeing Ian, but I'd called it off before Christmas because he had lied about the status of his marriage. I also added that he was becoming abusive. Yes, I'd been seeing Dan in recent weeks. Yes, Ian had become obsessively jealous. He was so jealous of my new relationship that he had had Dan fired on what turned out to be spurious grounds and had threatened him with physical violence. Yes, I'd seen Dan after that. In fact, I'd gone over to his house on the night he was fired, Tuesday, because I was worried Ian was going to enact some form of aggression. When I got there, I spoke with his neighbour, Mrs. Chu, who confirmed my fears that something had already happened. Thankfully, Dan was okay. I found him cleaning up a tremendous mess, apparently caused by Ian, who had let himself in the house using the firm's copy of the front door key, attempted unsuccessfully to assault Dan, and smashed a giant mirror and a number of ceramics, among other things. During the scuffle, Dan had punched Ian in the face, in self-defense. Yes, I stayed at Dan's on Tuesday night. I'd also gone over there with Zah on Wednesday for dinner, but had gone home after that. Dan and I didn't want to rush the relationship. No, I hadn't seen Dan since then. He hadn't returned any of my calls. No, I didn't understand why Ian would keep insisting that I was at Dan's house on the evening of the murder. Of course I hadn't been. And I didn't know about any gun. None of that made any sense. It sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. No, I hadn't been at work. I'd taken leave due to Ian's continual sexual harassment, which was well attested to by my colleagues, and predated Dan's arrival by weeks, if not months. And even if it were true that I was once a prostitute, as Ian kept insisting, what would make that remotely relevant? Zah told the police that Dan had been helping their band with their music. He had salvaged their gig at the Espy with his knowledge of sound engineering, and they had become friends after that. Apparently he'd helped them prepare an EP for presentation to Fungus Records, mixing their music using software on his home computer. Zah hadn't seen Dan since Wednesday night, when he and I had come over for dinner. Dan had promised to work on the EP for the Friday deadline, and Zah had gone around the following day to see how it was going. Dan wasn't home. Zah subsequently discovered that Dan had uploaded the EP to SoundCloud on Friday. He'd even sent a link to the record company as promised. But Wednesday night was the last time Zah had seen or heard from Dan. The officers who interviewed us told us privately that our statements correlated with that of Dan's neighbour, Mrs. Chu. She had seen Ian arriving and leaving on Tuesday night, heard the sounds of a violent encounter, and seen him leaving with a bloody face. She had also received a telephone call from Dan on Sunday evening, just before the murder, saying that Ian was back and was looking murderous. This had gone through to her message bank. The police have a copy of his anguished call. Apparently he left a similar message on 000 shortly after that. Good old Mrs. Chu also said she noticed that Zah and I had gone over for dinner on Wednesday, but that our car, Zah's, had left just after midnight. She said she hadn't heard any activity from the house after that. No one had come or gone. The papers have had this whole sorry tale on the front page almost every day. The Age ran a story this morning with a picture of Ian being taken out of court, his head covered by a towel. The initial charge was grievous bodily harm, but this has now been upgraded to murder. Although the cause of the victim's death was heart failure, it appears to have been precipitated entirely by the physical assault inflicted by Ian. The police had taken the relatively unusual step of issuing a statement outlining the key evidence, namely that the body was found in the boot of Ian's car with his DNA present. Some of mine was found on the body, but that was explicable by reference to my relationship with Dan. None of my DNA was found on the back of the rug, for example. that forensics evidence from the Prince's Hill house indicated that a violent struggle had taken place between Dan and Ian in the kitchen and hallway, that fibres from the rug were found both in the lounge, where it was originally located, as well as the garage, where the body must have been loaded in the vehicle. In other words, it seemed the Crown's evidence was so strong and straightforward that the police and DPP weren't even bothering to keep their cards close to their chests before the trial. The case was open and shut. I suspect they did this for tactical reasons. They wanted to pressure Ian into pleading guilty. They didn't want a rich lawyer dragging out such a hopeless case. Yesterday I spoke with Paige Turner at Billings, and she told me that the house isn't even a crime scene any longer, although the police may want to come back to gather more evidence if they need to, which seems very unlikely. Apparently I'm free to go and get my things now if I want to. More than that, she said she'd gotten a letter from Picklejig to the effect that I could stay at the house as his guest whenever I liked. Of course, there had been frenzied media speculation concerning the enigmatic victim, the late Dan Djurdjevic. His circumstances were deeply puzzling, hinting at high levels of desperation, possibly as a result of some kind of extortion being applied to him. For example, the police had recovered from Ian's house 2 wads of cash totaling $50,000. Some of it was smeared with Ian's blood. And apparently Dan was back in Perth on the Thursday before the murder. While there, he seemed to have taken $50,000 cash from his mortgage redraw, the maximum amount available. By Sunday afternoon, he was back in Melbourne. No air, rail, or road records existed of his travels. Journalists speculated that he somehow travelled under an assumed name, but no one knew how or why. Thankfully, none of this really mattered. Ian had been found with Dan's body in the boot of his car, and his own DNA all over both the body and the crime scene. Even the $50,000 found at Ian's house was explicable. It seemed to have come from Dan's and Kylie's mortgage redraw facility, although there was no way of verifying this. If Kylie wanted the money, she would have to make a criminal injuries compensation application and prove that the cash at Ian's house had come from Dan and was somehow connected to the crime. I'm awfully glad now that Dan and Frank only ever planned to use the counterfeit money as a lure. Imagine the added complication of counterfeit notes. Today's front page article rehashed all of the above, adding a few extra details, but its main focus was Ian's fitness to stand trial. It seemed that his mental state was deteriorating rapidly. Ian had previously insisted that he was held at gunpoint and assaulted by Dan. He said he had no idea how Dan then killed himself and got into my boot. But in yesterday's hearing he also blurted out that he was the victim of some sort of conspiracy, that his body had been swapped around, so that he was now back to front. Former associates noted how he was parting his hair the other way, as if to make some sort of point. The hearing had been adjourned pending a psychiatric evaluation. I was sitting at the breakfast table with all of this in the back of my mind, having a cup of coffee and some toast and wondering whether to go to work or not. I was still on annual leave. I never bothered to apply for sick leave, and Branka understood well enough to let me take a holiday at short notice. It was already 8 a.m., and Tsar was still nowhere to be seen. Normally I would have been chasing him out of his bed, but now that his band was officially on the Fungus Records label, I was inclined to cut him some slack. In fact, that's what Tsar and Silvio had come around to tell us on Sunday, that Fungus was so impressed with the EP that they wanted to sign the people as soon as possible. What's more, in 3 weeks' time, Fungus were going to fly the boys to New York to record. They were going to be there for 6 weeks or more, all expenses paid. With that in mind, there really didn't seem much point in Tsar going to his TAFE classes. Anyway, he'd lost his computer and all his work. I was thinking all this when Tsar's door burst open and he ran into the room. "Hey, Joss, have you read the news?" "Sure have, mate. I've got the paper right here," I said, tapping my folded copy of The Age. I'm still old school. I like reading things on real paper. "Ah, shit, get with the internet age, will you, sis? Check this out." Zar handed me his iPhone, the one Dan had purchased for the meeting with Ian at Cafe Ecocina. He had the Age website open. On its cover story, alleged Princess Hill murderer commits suicide. Ian's topped himself. Seems he couldn't stand seeing himself mirrored anymore. I suppose that would drive most people mad if they didn't know about the whole 3D printing stuff. Wow. I read on about how Ian had been found hanged from the tap at his sink using a strip of his towel. I'm aware that a reasonably firm, consistent pressure on the carotid sinus will knock you out after 6 to 10 seconds, and that brain death will start 6 minutes or so after that. Apparently it was only 7 minutes between the routine suicide checks. By the time they untied Ian from the sink, he could not be revived. What do you reckon? Ding dong, the witch is dead. We're all free. No trial, no chance he'll get off with clever lawyers, no nothing. It's all over. I just took a very deep breath and sat back, trying to process it all. Once more my eyes were starting to fill and my vision started to blur. What's up, Juss? Aren't you happy? You bet I'm happy. I'm just thinking, I said, wiping my cheeks. About what? Whether I even have to go to work anymore. You mean because I'm going to be a famous rock star? I laughed through my tears. You could say that, buddy. Zar put his arms around me from behind my chair and placed his cheek against mine. You don't need to hang around here anymore, sis. You can do whatever you want. And you don't need to worry about me. I'll be fine, no matter what happens. Dan! I had him on FaceTime. Zar and the other band members had gone off to a meeting at Fungus's offices. I could see it was evening, and Dan was in the kitchen at Frank's house, a tea towel on his shoulder, as usual. Justine, my lovely, how are things? And a big hello from me, too, yelled Frank from the background. I could see him setting the table. We're about to have dinner. Want to join us? Asked Dan, winking. That's not as absurd as you might think. Have you seen the online version of The Age? Eh? No, can't say I have. What's up? Has Ian pleaded? No, he's committed suicide. You're kidding. I'm not. Take a look. Hold on, I heard Frank say, as he pulled out his own phone and started the browser. After a couple of seconds he said, He's right, Dan. Ian's hanged himself. Wow, so this means... No trial. The house is now definitely okay to use. Well, I don't know if I should be coming over just yet. Don't be an idiot. I want to use it. What for? I had to sigh. Sometimes men can be totally dense. So that I can be with you, dummy. I was feeling awfully glad that the police didn't consider the basement to be part of the crime scene. The action appeared to have taken place entirely in the hallway, kitchen, and garage. Frank had temporarily decommissioned the printers anyway, as a precaution. Had the forensics team bothered to test it for DNA, they probably would have found Ian's there, and Frank would have had to fry all the electronics completely. Apparently there's a way he can do that, but this would have made the printers permanently unusable. The studio would have to be rebuilt from scratch. However, as things stood, all Frank had to do was restore some code. So what about Zar? He's okay, now that the band is signed to the record label and everything. So what do you say? Will you escort me? I don't want to do it on my own. Not the first time, anyway. You bet. Name the day. Well, I think I'll need the rest of the weekend to tie up loose ends. Then I have to pack, say goodbye to people, including Zar and Sylvia, of course. How about this time on Sunday? Actually, I have an even better idea. Sunday for sure. But let's make it a little later. How does 1 p.m. your time sound? Okay, I suppose, but I don't get it. Why the delay, I mean? That's 3 a.m. where you are, for God's sake. Well, Dan looked at me sheepishly. I just got an email reminding me that there are still a handful of tickets for one of the last Hunters and Collectors shows ever. It's this weekend in Kings Park in Perth. Maybe We could do a stop over there, see the concert, and go home after that. Besides, we'll be right way round when we finally get to Rio, and that would be good, especially since I'm seeing a doctor on Monday to talk about my heart operation. What if somebody sees you? It's a big city. I wouldn't worry. And if anyone does happen to see us, let them think they saw a ghost. I don't care. Okay, I replied, laughing. I know how much that band means to you. How about Frank? Will he join us? I could see Frank in the background, shaking his head and waving his hands simultaneously. He's saying no. He doesn't think he should travel just yet. Oh, of course. Well, it's a date then. I can hardly wait. See you at the house on Sunday at 1 p.m. And brace yourself. I have some news. Some big news. With that, Dan blew me a kiss, and the line disconnected.